I was knee-deep in sewage water when I realized my peaceful suburban life in Aurora, Colorado, had just become a nightmare. The stench hit me first, acrid and nauseating, as I descended the basement stairs that Friday evening in March, expecting to grab some old camping gear for the weekend trip I had planned with my son. Instead, my foot splashed into 3 inches of contaminated water that had somehow invaded my finished basement, ruining everything I had spent the last 5 years building and collecting. My name is Vincent Farrow, and I'm a 42-year-old software engineer who bought this house in the Meadowbrook subdivision 7 years ago, back when the neighborhood was just starting to develop. I had watched this community grow from a handful of homes into a sprawling network of cookie-cutter houses, manicured lawns, and the inevitable formation of what would become the bane of my existence, the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association. For the first few years, the HOA was relatively benign, sending out occasional reminders about trash can placement and Christmas decoration removal dates. But 2 years ago, everything changed when Deborah Pritchard was elected president. Deborah was exactly what you would picture if someone said the words HOA president to you. She was a 53-year-old woman with a blonde bob that never moved, even in the strongest Colorado winds, designer sunglasses perpetually perched on her head, and an arsenal of pastel cardigans that she wore like armor. She drove a white Mercedes SUV with a Meadowbrook HOA board member bumper sticker, and she patrolled the neighborhood like a hawk searching for violations. I had received 3 citations in the past year alone, one for leaving my trash cans visible from the street 15 minutes past the designated time, one for having grass that was allegedly a 1/4 inch too tall, and one for a small oil stain on my driveway that I had cleaned up the same day I received the notice. But this flooding situation was something entirely different. As I stood in my basement watching brown water seep through the foundation wall, I felt my blood pressure rising. This was not some minor aesthetic violation. This was serious property damage, and I had a sinking feeling that the HOA was somehow responsible. I grabbed my phone and called my neighbor, Tom Martinez, who lived 3 houses down. Tom was a contractor with 30 years of experience, and more importantly, he was one of the few people in the neighborhood who shared my frustration with Deborah's regime. "Gee, Tom, I need you to come over right now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "My basement is flooding, and I think it has something to do with that construction project the HOA was doing last week." Tom arrived within 10 minutes, work boots already on his feet. He took one look at my basement and let out a low whistle. "When did this start?" "I have no idea. I've been traveling for work since Monday. I just got home an hour ago and came down here to grab some camping equipment. This is the first time I have been in the basement since Sunday night, and it was completely dry then." Tom walked along the wall where the water was entering, running his hand along the foundation. "Vincent, do you remember that retention wall project the HOA approved last month? The one they said was for erosion control?" I nodded. The HOA had sent out a notice in February explaining that they were building a retention wall along the eastern property line of the common area, which bordered several homes, including mine. The notice claimed it was necessary to prevent erosion and manage water runoff. They had started construction the previous week while I was preparing for my business trip. I had seen the construction crew working, but had not paid much attention to the details. That wall," Tom continued, his face grim, "is diverting all the water runoff from the hill directly toward your property. I noticed it when they were building it, and I even mentioned something to one of the construction guys. He said they were just following the plans approved by the HOA. Are you telling me the HOA built something that is deliberately flooding my house?" "Not deliberately, but incompetently. Whoever designed that wall did not account for proper drainage. All the water that used to naturally flow down the hill and into the drainage system is now being channeled straight toward the houses on this side of the development. Your house is just the lowest point, so you are getting hit the hardest." I felt anger rising in my chest, hot and urgent. "I need to document this. Can you help me?" For the next 2 hours, Tom and I photographed and videoed everything. We documented the water damage in my basement, the ruined furniture, my destroyed home office setup, boxes of family memories that were now floating in contaminated water. We went outside and filmed the retention wall, showing how it was positioned and how water was clearly flowing from it directly toward my property. Tom even drew diagrams explaining the drainage problem, pointing out where catch basins should have been installed but were not. By the time we finished, it was nearly midnight. My basement had accumulated another inch of water, and I had to shut off the power to the basement circuit to avoid any electrical hazards. I spent the night on my couch, too angry and anxious to sleep, making lists of everything that had been damaged and calculating the cost. My preliminary estimate was approaching $30,000, and that was before I even considered the cost of fixing the foundation issues that this flooding would inevitably cause if it continued. Saturday morning, I was at Deborah's door at 8 o'clock sharp. She lived in one of the larger homes in the development, a 2-story colonial with a pristine front yard and a decorative flag that said, "Welcome Friends," hanging by her door. The irony was not lost on me. Deborah answered the door in a pink velour tracksuit, her hair already perfectly styled despite the early hour. Her smile faltered when she saw my expression. "Vincent, this is quite early for a social call." "This is not a social call, Deborah. My basement flooded yesterday because of that retention wall your HOA built. I need you to come see the damage right now and tell me how the association plans to fix this." Her face shifted into what I had come to recognize as her official HOA business expression, a combination of concern and defensiveness. "I am sure you are mistaken. That retention wall was designed by a licensed engineer and built to code. It could not possibly be causing flooding." "Then you will not mind coming to see the evidence." Deborah hesitated, then grabbed her keys. "Fine, but I'm sure this is just a coincidence. We've had some rain this week." "We have had half an inch of rain, Deborah. That does not cause 3 inches of standing water in a basement that has never flooded before in 7 years. At my house, I led her down to the basement. The water had risen slightly overnight, now covering the entire floor at a depth of about 4 inches. My leather couch was ruined, the bottom cushions soaked through. My desk, which I had custom built 3 years ago, was warped and splitting. Boxes of my son's baby photos, my late father's military memorabilia, and countless other irreplaceable items were destroyed. Deborah's face went pale, but she quickly recovered. "This is unfortunate, Vincent, but you cannot just assume the retention wall caused this. Have you had your plumbing checked? This could be a sewage backup." "It is groundwater, not sewage, and it is coming through the foundation wall on the side facing your retention wall. Tom Martinez already confirmed that the wall is diverting all the drainage directly at my house." "Tom Martinez is not a licensed engineer." "No, but he is a contractor with 30 years of experience, and he knows improper drainage when he sees it. I am giving you official notice that the HOA is responsible for this damage, and I expect the association to pay for repairs and remediation." Deborah crossed her arms. "The HOA will need to investigate this claim. I will bring it up at the next board meeting." "The next board meeting is not for 3 weeks. My basement is flooding right now. I need this fixed immediately." "I'm sorry, Vincent, but we have procedures. I will put this on the agenda, and the board will discuss it. In the meantime, you should contact your homeowner's insurance. My homeowner's insurance does not cover flooding caused by HOA negligence. This is the association's responsibility." Deborah's expression hardened. "That is your opinion. The board will make the final determination. Good day, Vincent." She walked out of my house, leaving me standing in my flooded basement shaking with rage. I immediately called my insurance company, knowing what they would say but needing to follow proper procedure. As expected, the claims adjuster who came out Monday morning confirmed that this was not covered under my policy. The flooding was caused by an external source, specifically the improper drainage from the retention wall, and that made it the HOA's liability, not mine. I spent the next week dealing with the aftermath. I rented industrial fans and a water pump to remove the standing water. I pulled out all the damaged furniture and belongings. Documenting everything for the insurance claim I planned to file against the HOA. I contacted 3 different contractors to get estimates on the repairs needed: foundation waterproofing, wall restoration, flooring replacement, electrical work, and mold remediation. The estimates ranged from $35,000 to $42,000. Meanwhile, it rained again on Tuesday night, and my basement flooded again. This time even worse because the ground was already saturated. I spent the entire night running pumps, watching helplessly as water poured through my foundation wall faster than I could remove it. On Wednesday, I received a certified letter from the HOA. My hands shook as I opened it, expecting some acknowledgement of responsibility or at least a plan to address the drainage issue. Instead, I found a cease and desist letter warning me that I had violated HOA regulations by placing unsightly industrial equipment in my backyard without approval. The industrial equipment they were referring to was the water pump I had positioned near my foundation to keep my basement from flooding. That was when I realized that Deborah and the HOA board had no intention of taking responsibility for their mistake. They were going to stonewall me, hide behind bureaucracy, and let my house be destroyed rather than admit they had made a catastrophic error. I called an attorney that afternoon. His name was Richard Kellerman, and he specialized in property law and HOA disputes. His office was in downtown Denver, and he agreed to meet with me the following day. Richard was in his early 60s, with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to assess everything in the room simultaneously. I laid out my entire case: the construction of the retention wall, the flooding, the HOA's refusal to take responsibility, and the continued damage to my property. He listened carefully, reviewing the photos, videos, contractor estimates, and Tom's drainage diagrams. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "Vincent, you have a strong case. The HOA's liability here is clear. They built a structure that caused direct damage to your property, and they have failed to remedy the situation. However, I need to be honest with you about what you are facing. HOA cases like this can take years to resolve. The association has insurance and lawyers who will drag this out as long as possible. You are looking at depositions, expert witnesses, possibly a trial. It could cost you $50,000 in legal fees, and even if you win, collecting the judgment can be another battle entirely. So what are you saying? I should just accept that my house is being destroyed?" "No, I am saying you have options, but none of them are quick or easy. You could sue the HOA, and you would likely win eventually. You could try to negotiate a settlement, but based on what you have told me about Deborah Pritchard, that seems unlikely." Or, he paused, choosing his words carefully, "you could consider other approaches." "What other approaches?" "The retention wall is on HOA common property, but it is causing damage to your private property. In Colorado, property owners have the right to abate nuisances that cause ongoing damage. Now, I am not officially advising you to take matters into your own hands, but hypothetically speaking, if someone were to remove the source of the problem and then seek reimbursement through small claims court or arbitration, that might resolve the issue more quickly than a prolonged lawsuit." I understood what he was suggesting, even if he was not saying it directly. If I tore down the retention wall myself, what would be the legal consequences? Hypothetically, the HOA could try to sue you for destruction of common property. However, they would have to prove that the wall was properly constructed and not causing damage to your property, which your evidence clearly contradicts. You would have a strong defense based on necessity and self-help abatement of a nuisance. The worst-case scenario is that you would end up in the same legal battle you are already facing, but with your basement no longer flooding. I left Richard's office with my mind racing. Was I really considering tearing down an HOA structure myself? It seemed insane, reckless, and potentially illegal. But as I drove home and saw water stains creeping up the exterior of my foundation, I felt a clarity I had not experienced in weeks. The HOA was not going to help me. The legal system would take years. My house was being destroyed while I waited for bureaucracy to grind forward. Something had to be done, and I was the only one who was going to do it. That evening, I called Tom Martinez again. "Tom, I need your honest opinion. If someone wanted to remove that retention wall, how difficult would it be?" Tom was quiet for a moment. "You're thinking about taking it down yourself?" "Maybe." "Vincent, that is a bold move. Deborah will lose her mind." "Deborah has already lost her mind. My basement is flooded again. I ran the pumps all last night. I cannot keep living like this." Tom sighed. "The wall is not structurally complex. It is basically decorative blocks stacked and mortared together with minimal foundation. You would need a small excavator to pull it down, a jackhammer to break up the concrete footer, and a dump truck to haul away the debris. The whole job could be done in a day with the right equipment. The real question is whether you are prepared for the fallout. I have documentation of everything. I have contractor statements, photos, videos, evidence of the drainage problem. If the HOA wants to fight me, I have the proof that their wall destroyed my property. Then I will help you, Tom said. But we need to do this right. We document everything before, during, and after. We make sure we are not damaging anything beyond the wall itself. And we need to be prepared for Deborah to call the police, because she absolutely will. We planned it for Saturday, exactly 3 weeks after my basement first flooded. Tom rented a small excavator and arranged for a debris hauler to be on standby. I contacted 2 more contractors to be present as witnesses, ensuring that we had professional documentation of the work. I also hired a professional videographer to record the entire process, creating a complete record of the wall's removal and the drainage improvements that would result. Friday night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. What if the police arrested me? What if the HOA successfully sued me for damages? What if I was making everything worse? But then I would remember the smell of my flooded basement, the boxes of ruined memories, the constant stress of wondering when the next rainstorm would come and how much more damage it would cause. I had tried everything the right way. I'd followed procedures, contacted the HOA, hired lawyers, documented everything, and still, my house was being destroyed, while the HOA did nothing. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright. Tom arrived at 7 o'clock with the excavator on a trailer. The 2 contractor witnesses showed up shortly after, along with the videographer. We spent the first hour documenting the existing conditions, the retention wall's current state, the drainage patterns, the water damage to my foundation, and the soggy ground between the wall and my house. At 8:30, Tom fired up the excavator. The machine's engine roared to life, and I felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with terror. This was really happening. I was about to tear down an HOA structure in broad daylight. Tom was methodical and careful. He started at one end of the wall, using the excavator's bucket to pull away the decorative blocks. They came apart more easily than I expected, the mortar having been poorly applied during the original construction. As each section fell, we could see more evidence of the shoddy workmanship. No proper drainage pipes, no gravel backfill, no waterproofing measures. The wall had been built as cheaply as possible, with no regard for proper water management. We had been working for about 45 minutes when I heard the unmistakable sound of Deborah's voice shrieking from the street. "What do you think you are doing? Stop immediately!" I turned to see Deborah running across the common area toward us, her face red with rage. She was wearing white capri pants and a lavender sweater, and she was moving faster than I thought possible for someone in designer flats. I walked to meet her, positioning myself between her and the worksite. "I am removing a nuisance structure that has been flooding my basement for 3 weeks. That is HOA property. You have no right to touch it. I am calling the police right now." "Go ahead. I have documentation showing that this wall has caused over $40,000 in damage to my property, and the HOA has refused to address the problem. In Colorado, property owners have the right to abate nuisances." Deborah's hands shook as she pulled out her phone. "You're going to jail for this, Vincent. You are destroying community property." "I am protecting my home from an improperly constructed drainage system that your HOA approved and installed." She was already dialing, screaming into the phone about vandalism and destruction of property. I turned back to Tom and signaled him to continue. We had anticipated this moment, and we had agreed that we would work as quickly as possible to complete the removal before any authorities arrived. The other neighbors had started to emerge from their houses, drawn by the noise of the excavator and Deborah's screaming. I saw at least a dozen people gathering to watch, some with their phones out, recording the scene. Part of me was embarrassed to be the center of this drama, but a larger part of me felt justified. I was not the villain here. I was a homeowner trying to protect my property from an incompetent HOA. 2 police cars arrived within 15 minutes, lights flashing. Tom shut down the excavator, and we all waited as 2 officers approached. Deborah rushed to meet them, gesturing wildly and talking so fast I could barely understand her words. The older of the 2 officers, a gray-haired man with a calm demeanor, held up his hand to quiet Deborah, then walked over to me. "Sir, I am Officer Patterson. Can you explain what is happening here?" I took a deep breath and explained the entire situation: the retention wall construction, the flooding, the HOA's refusal to take responsibility, the ongoing damage to my property, and my decision to remove the nuisance structure. I showed him my phone with photos of my flooded basement, the contractor estimates, and Tom's drainage diagrams. Officer Patterson listened carefully, then walked over to examine the partially demolished wall. He looked at the exposed foundation, the lack of drainage infrastructure, and the obvious water damage to my property. He conferred quietly with the second officer, then returned to where Deborah and I were standing. "Madam, this appears to be a civil dispute between the homeowner and the HOA. From what I can see, the gentleman has a legitimate claim that this wall has caused damage to his property. Unless you can show me evidence that he is violating a specific criminal statute, this is not a police matter." Deborah's face turned an alarming shade of purple. "He is destroying community property. That is vandalism. Vandalism requires criminal intent to damage property. He is claiming he is abating a nuisance that is causing ongoing damage to his home. That is a civil matter. You will need to take this up with your HOA board and possibly pursue legal action, but I am not going to arrest anyone today." "This is outrageous. You are letting him get away with destroying HOA property." Officer Patterson's expression remained neutral. "Madam, I suggest you contact your HOA attorney and let them handle this through proper legal channels. We are going to clear the scene now. Sir," he turned to me, "I recommend you document everything you are doing here and be prepared for potential legal action from the HOA." "I understand, officer. I have contractors and a videographer documenting the entire process." The police left, and Deborah stood in the middle of the common area, trembling with rage. Several neighbors had approached during the commotion, and I could hear them murmuring among themselves. A few were clearly on Deborah's side, shaking their heads at my audacity. But others, particularly those who had dealt with HOA overreach themselves, seemed sympathetic. Tom restarted the excavator, and we continued working. It took another 3 hours to completely remove the wall and break up the concrete footer. As we worked, we discovered even more evidence of poor construction. The footer was only 4 inches deep in most places, far below the 18-inch minimum required by code for a retention structure. The drainage pipe that should have been installed behind the wall was completely absent. It was abundantly clear that whoever built this wall had cut every possible corner. By early afternoon, the wall was gone. The debris had been loaded into the dump truck and hauled away. Tom used the excavator to regrade the area, creating a gentle slope that would direct water away from my property and toward the designated drainage system. We installed a proper French drain along the property line with perforated pipe and gravel backfill, ensuring that future water runoff would be managed correctly. The videographer captured everything, and the contractor witnesses signed statements confirming the wall's improper construction and the necessary corrections we had made. I took hundreds of photos showing the before, during, and after conditions. As Tom loaded the excavator back onto the trailer, several neighbors approached me. The first was Jennifer Cooper, who lived 2 houses down from Deborah. "Bina. Vincent, I just want you to know that I think what you did today took a lot of courage. My husband and I have been dealing with HOA harassment for years, and it is about time someone stood up to them." Another neighbor, Marcus Chen, added, "I'm on your side too. I noticed water pooling in my yard after they built that wall. I think you just fixed a problem that would have affected all of us eventually." Not everyone was supportive. Greg Hoffman, one of Deborah's allies, made a point of telling me that I would regret this decision and that the HOA would make sure I paid for every penny of damage. But more people seemed relieved than angry, and I realized that Deborah's reign had created more resentment than I had known. That evening, I sat in my clean, dry basement and felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in 3 weeks, I was not worried about pumps failing or water rising. The source of the problem was gone, and my property was protected. Of course, the battle was far from over. Monday morning, I received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney demanding that I restore the retention wall immediately and threatening legal action for destruction of common property. I responded through Richard Kellerman, my attorney, with a detailed letter explaining the nuisance abatement doctrine, attaching all my documentation of the wall's improper construction and the damage it had caused to my property. I also included an itemized bill for $43,500, covering my basement repairs, the cost of the wall removal, the proper drainage installation, and the rental equipment. The HOA's response was predictably hostile. They refused to acknowledge any liability and demanded that I pay for reconstruction of the wall. They also hit me with $5,000 in fines for various alleged violations, including the unauthorized removal of HOA property. Richard filed a lawsuit on my behalf in county court, seeking compensation for the property damage and injunctive relief preventing the HOA from rebuilding the wall without proper drainage infrastructure. The HOA countersued for destruction of property and sought to foreclose on my home for the unpaid fines. The legal battle dragged on for months. Discovery was contentious, with the HOA trying to block access to the engineering plans and construction documents for the original wall. We eventually obtained those documents through a court order, and they revealed exactly what I had suspected. The wall had been designed by an unqualified individual who was friends with Deborah, not by a licensed engineer, as she had claimed. The construction had been done by the cheapest bidder, and no proper permits had been obtained because the HOA had classified it as a minor landscaping project rather than a structural installation. This revelation changed everything. Not only had the HOA built a structure that damaged my property, but they had done so illegally, without permits or proper engineering oversight. Richard immediately filed an amended complaint adding claims for fraud and gross negligence. The case finally went to trial 9 months after I tore down the wall. Those 9 months were exhausting. The HOA continued to fine me for various petty violations, trying to build a case that I was a troublemaker who refused to follow community rules. They denied my access to HOA amenities, citing the pending litigation. They even tried to prevent me from voting in HOA elections, though Richard quickly obtained a court order blocking that attempt. But I also found unexpected support. Other homeowners began coming forward with their own complaints about Deborah and the HOA board. It turned out that several people had experienced water issues after the wall was built, though none as severe as mine. Others had been hit with excessive fines for minor violations. A group of concerned homeowners formed a coalition and began attending board meetings, demanding transparency and accountability. The trial lasted 3 days. Richard methodically presented our case: the improper construction, the lack of permits, the false claims about engineering oversight, the extensive damage to my property, and the HOA's refusal to take responsibility. He called Tom Martinez and the other contractors as expert witnesses, and they testified about the wall's numerous code violations and drainage deficiencies. He presented the video documentation of the wall removal, showing the shoddy construction that had been hidden beneath the decorative facade. The HOA's attorney tried to argue that I had acted improperly by taking matters into my own hands, that I should have gone through the courts rather than demolishing the wall myself. But Richard countered effectively, pointing out that my property was being actively damaged while the HOA refused to act, giving me the right to abate the nuisance under Colorado law. The turning point came when Richard called an independent civil engineer as a witness. This engineer, Dr. Patricia Reeves, had reviewed all the evidence and conducted her own site inspection. Her testimony was devastating to the HOA's case. "In my professional opinion," she stated clearly, "the retention wall as originally constructed was not only inadequate, but dangerous. It violated multiple building codes and engineering standards. The lack of proper drainage infrastructure made flooding of adjacent properties inevitable. Furthermore, the wall's shallow foundation made it structurally unstable. If Mr. Farrow had not removed it when he did, it would likely have collapsed during the next major rainstorm, potentially causing even more extensive damage." The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s named Sandra Whitmore, listened to everything with careful attention. I could not read her expression during most of the trial, but I noticed her frown deepening when Richard presented evidence that the HOA had known about the drainage problems before my basement flooded. We had obtained emails through discovery showing that another homeowner had complained about water issues 2 weeks before my flood, and Deborah had dismissed those concerns as insignificant. In her ruling, Judge Whitmore was thorough and unsparing. She found that the HOA had been negligent in approving and constructing the retention wall without proper engineering oversight or permits. She found that the wall had directly caused the flooding damage to my property. She found that my decision to remove the wall constituted lawful abatement of a nuisance under Colorado law. And most significantly, she found that the HOA's conduct after the flooding, including their refusal to address the problem and their retaliatory fines, constituted bad faith and warranted punitive damages. Judge Whitmore awarded me $43,500 for my property damage and repair costs, plus $15,000 in punitive damages, plus my attorney's fees of nearly $30,000. She also issued an injunction preventing the HOA from rebuilding any retention structures in that area without obtaining proper permits, having designs reviewed by a licensed engineer, and providing notice to all affected homeowners. The HOA was also ordered to pay a $5,000 fine to the county for building without permits, and the county building department opened an investigation into other unpermitted projects the HOA had completed over the past 3 years. I walked out of that courtroom feeling vindicated but exhausted. The 9-month battle had taken a toll on me emotionally and financially. Yes, I had won, and yes, I would be compensated, but I had also spent countless hours preparing for the case, dealing with the stress and living in a neighborhood where I was now infamous as the man who sued the HOA. But something unexpected happened in the weeks after the verdict. The coalition of homeowners who had been organizing throughout the trial called for a special election to recall the entire HOA board. The recall effort gained momentum quickly, fueled by the revelations from the trial and growing frustration with Deborah's leadership. Within 2 months, enough signatures were gathered to trigger a vote. The recall election was held on a rainy Saturday in November, almost exactly a year after I had first discovered my flooded basement. The turnout was unprecedented, with over 80% of homeowners casting ballots. The results were decisive. Deborah Pritchard and the entire board were removed from office by a margin of more than 2-1. A new board was elected, composed of homeowners who had been part of the Reform Coalition. Their first act was to hire a professional management company to handle HOA operations, removing the day-to-day power from volunteer board members who often let personal agendas interfere with community governance. Their second act was to conduct a comprehensive review of all HOA construction projects from the past 5 years, identifying numerous code violations and unpermitted work. The revelations from that review were shocking. The HOA had built a playground structure without permits, paved a parking area without proper drainage, and installed decorative lighting that did not meet electrical codes. The total cost to bring everything into compliance was estimated at over $200,000, money that would have to come from a special assessment on all homeowners. This led to another investigation, this time focused on how the HOA had been spending community funds. A forensic accountant discovered that Deborah had been awarding contracts to friends and family members without competitive bidding, often at inflated prices. While there was no evidence of direct kickbacks or embezzlement, the pattern of sweetheart deals had cost the HOA tens of thousands of dollars over several years. The new board filed a civil suit against Deborah and the former board members for breach of fiduciary duty. That case was still pending when something more serious emerged. The county building inspector who had been reviewing the unpermitted projects discovered that one of the HOA's contractors had falsified inspection documents for the playground structure. Further investigation revealed that Deborah had known the inspections were not legitimate, but had approved the project anyway, knowingly accepting fraudulent documents. This crossed the line from civil negligence into criminal fraud. The county district attorney opened an investigation, and in February, nearly a year and a half after my basement first flooded, Deborah Pritchard was arrested on charges of fraud and official misconduct. I was not present for the arrest, but I heard about it from Jennifer Cooper, who called me excitedly that evening. "Vincent, did you hear? They arrested Deborah this morning. The police showed up at her house with a warrant. My husband saw her being led out in handcuffs." I felt a complex mix of emotions. On one hand, I had never wanted anyone to be arrested. I had just wanted my basement fixed and the HOA to take responsibility for their mistake. On the other hand, the investigation had uncovered genuine criminal conduct that went far beyond the retention wall issue. Deborah had not just been an overzealous HOA president, she'd been actively engaged in fraudulent practices that put homeowners at risk. The criminal case moved forward, and Deborah eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges of official misconduct and filing false documents. She received a sentence of 2 years probation, 500 hours of community service, and was permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in Colorado. She was also ordered to pay restitution to the HOA for the costs associated with bringing all the unpermitted projects into compliance. As for me, I finally had my basement fully restored in December, more than a year after the initial flooding. The space looked better than it had before, with new flooring, fresh drywall, updated electrical, and a comprehensive waterproofing system that would prevent any future water intrusion. The check from the HOA had cleared, covering every penny of my damages, plus the punitive award and attorney's fees. My relationship with my neighbors had also evolved. While a few people still viewed me as a troublemaker who had gone too far, most had come to see me as someone who had stood up to corruption and incompetence. I received thank you cards from several homeowners who felt that my lawsuit had exposed problems that never would have come to light otherwise. The new HOA board operated transparently, holding regular meetings with open forums for homeowner concerns. They published detailed financial reports quarterly and required competitive bidding for all projects over $5,000. The neighborhood felt different, less oppressive, more like an actual community rather than a regime controlled by one person's whims. One Saturday in March, almost exactly 2 years after that terrible night when I first discovered my flooded basement, I was working in my yard when Tom Martinez walked over with a beer in each hand. "Thought you might want this," he said, handing me one of the bottles. We stood in my driveway, looking at the area where the retention wall had once stood. The French drain we had installed was functioning perfectly, managing water flow even during heavy rainstorms. My basement had remained completely dry through the entire winter, even during the major snowstorm in January that had dumped 18 inches of snow on Aurora. "You know," Tom said, "when you first told me you were thinking about tearing down that wall, I thought you were crazy. I figured it would end with you losing your house or going to jail or something." I thought so too, honestly. There were a lot of moments when I questioned whether I had made a huge mistake. But you were right. That wall was a disaster waiting to happen, and Deborah never would have fixed it on her own. Sometimes you have to take a stand, even when it is risky. I took a long drink of my beer, thinking about everything that had happened over the past 2 years. The stress, the legal battles, the financial uncertainty, the neighborhood drama. It had been one of the most difficult periods of my life. But my house was protected, my basement was restored, and an incompetent, corrupt HOA board had been removed from power. "Would you do it again?" Tom asked. "If you could go back to that day with the excavator, knowing everything that would happen afterward, would you still tear down the wall?" I considered the question carefully. The honest answer was complicated. The process had been brutal, expensive, and emotionally draining. I had spent months worried about losing my house, being sued into bankruptcy, or even facing criminal charges. The stress had affected my work, my relationship with my son, and my peace of mind. But I also thought about what would have happened if I had not acted. My basement would have continued flooding with every rainstorm. The damage would have worsened, potentially affecting the structural integrity of my entire house. The HOA would have continued denying responsibility, hiding behind bureaucracy while my property value plummeted. Deborah would have remained in power, continuing her pattern of awarding sketchy contracts and ignoring building codes. Other homeowners would have suffered from future projects built without proper oversight. Yes, I finally answered. I would do it again. Not because I wanted to become some kind of HOA vigilante or neighborhood hero. Just because it was my house, my property, my responsibility to protect it. When the system fails you, when the people in authority refuse to do the right thing, sometimes you have to take action yourself and deal with the consequences. Tom nodded slowly. That is a good answer. And for what it is worth, you have changed this neighborhood for the better. The new board actually cares about doing things right. People are not afraid of getting ridiculous fines anymore. You should feel proud of that. I appreciated his words, though pride was not exactly what I felt. Relief, maybe. Satisfaction that justice had been served, eventually. Gratitude that my home was safe and my finances had recovered. But mostly, I just felt tired. The kind of deep exhaustion that comes from fighting a long, difficult battle and finally being able to rest. That evening, I sat in my basement office, which had been completely rebuilt, and looked nothing like the sewage-soaked disaster from 2 years earlier. I had new furniture, new carpeting, new everything. My father's military memorabilia had been professionally restored as much as possible, though some items were lost forever. My son's baby photos had mostly been saved, thanks to some expensive photo restoration work. I thought about how much had changed since that terrible Friday evening when I came home from my business trip and found standing water where my home office should have been. I'd learned things about the legal system, about HOA governance, about property rights, and about myself that I never expected to learn. I had discovered reserves of stubbornness and determination I had not known I possessed. I had learned that sometimes doing the right thing means doing the difficult thing, even when everyone is telling you to just accept the situation and work within the system. I also learned that I was not alone in my frustrations with HOA overreach. The coalition that formed during my legal battle had grown into a permanent neighborhood organization that monitored HOA activities and advocated for homeowner rights. They had helped several other residents resolve disputes with the HOA, always emphasizing transparency and following proper procedures. The neighborhood had become more engaged, more informed, and more willing to hold leadership accountable. My phone buzzed with a text message from Richard Kellerman, my attorney. We had stayed in touch even after the case concluded, developing a friendship based on mutual respect. His message was simple. "Saw the news about Deborah's probation ending. How are you doing?" I typed back, "Good. House is great, basement is dry, life is back to normal. Thanks for everything." His response came quickly. "You did the hard work. I just made sure you did not get arrested for it. Proud of how you handled everything." I set down my phone and looked around my restored basement. This space had been at the center of a 2-year nightmare that had cost me money, time, and peace of mind. But it had also taught me that property ownership means more than just making mortgage payments and mowing the lawn. It means being willing to defend your home and your rights when they are threatened, even if the threat comes from the very organization that is supposed to protect community interests. The retention wall that the HOA built had been a physical disaster, a poorly constructed structure that damaged my property and violated building codes. But it had also been a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked HOA authority. Decisions made without proper expertise, projects approved without transparency, and leadership that refused to acknowledge mistakes or take responsibility for consequences. By tearing down that wall, I had not just fixed a drainage problem, I had torn down a symbol of that broken system. And while the legal battle that followed had been grueling, it had ultimately forced accountability, exposed corruption, and created lasting change in how the neighborhood was governed. Would I recommend my approach to others facing similar situations? That is a complicated question. What I did was risky, potentially illegal if the courts had ruled differently, and incredibly stressful. I had the benefit of strong documentation, expert witnesses, and a clear-cut case of HOA negligence. Not every situation would be so favorable. There were moments when I could have lost everything, when a different judge or a different set of facts might have resulted in me owing the HOA tens of thousands of dollars instead of the other way around. But I also believe that there are times when following proper procedures and working within broken systems simply allows injustice to continue. The HOA had no intention of fixing the drainage problem. They were perfectly content to let my basement flood while they hid behind board meetings and bureaucratic delays. If I had simply filed a lawsuit without addressing the immediate source of damage, my house would have continued deteriorating for years while the legal system ground forward at its glacial pace. Sometimes protecting your home requires taking bold action. Sometimes standing up for your rights means accepting risk and uncertainty. Sometimes doing the right thing means doing something that looks crazy to everyone around you until the facts prove you were correct all along. I walked upstairs from my dry, beautiful basement and stepped out into my backyard. The sun was setting over the Colorado Front Range, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I could see the area where the retention wall had stood, now replaced with proper drainage that functioned as it should have from the beginning. I could see my neighbors' houses, the community that had been torn apart by bad leadership and was now slowly healing and rebuilding trust. I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment, from that first night of standing in sewage water to the courtroom victory, to the arrest of a corrupt HOA president to this quiet evening in my backyard. It had been the hardest fight of my life, but it had also been necessary. My home was protected, my property rights had been vindicated, and an entire neighborhood was better off because I had been willing to fight back against incompetence and corruption. The retention wall was gone, demolished by an excavator on a Saturday morning that felt both reckless and righteous. In its place was proper drainage, proper governance, and a proper understanding that homeowners have rights that cannot be trampled by overzealous HOA boards. The bill had been paid not by me, but by those who had caused the damage in the first place, exactly as it should have been. I raised my beer toward the sunset, a private toast to survival, to justice, and to the simple satisfaction of a dry basement. The battle was over, the war was won, and I was finally completely home.